Hey, everybody, welcome to another episode of Purple Insider. And returning to the show from Pro Football Focus, Brad Spielberger. Brad, we've got a lot to discuss with the Minnesota Vikings, but I'm going to get right to it. I'm going to start right out here with what a lot of fans were talking about after the Vikings started 0-3 as it relates to their general manager, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah. I think that he made it quite clear where this direction was going for the roster by the moves they made this offseason. But it's a lot harder to watch a competitive rebuild without the competitive part, as the Vikings have started 0-3. Should Vikings fans, after this start and now the road that they know they have to go in order to turn this around to compete for the playoffs, should they feel any differently about the general manager than they did 3 weeks ago before the season started?
I think the biggest issue that I would point to maybe say yes is because let's say you were in the quote unquote competitive rebuild, but you had sophomores from the 2022 draft class and rookies from this year that were showing signs, that were stacking some good outings, that were giving you optimism and reason to believe, okay, as these guys grow, I'll feel more confident. Look, Jordan Addison does look good. That's great. Is he the only draft pick of the last 2 years that might actually mean anything? It's very possible the answer to that question is yes. I mean, Caleb Evans with a nice touchdown tip to Josh Palmer. You have, I mean, Lewis Cine is basically, if he was a third, fourth round pick, he's probably not on this roster. I don't think it's even hyperbolic to say he's your emergency sixth safety and special teams contributor. Andrew Booth is also on the depth chart probably because of his draft status. Might not even be on the roster if he was a later round pick. So, I mean, here's the thing though, and obviously this is Kwesi's fault, but how in this league you look at the body of work that Ryan Grigson presented and think it's a good idea to give him any say whatsoever over draft decisions? It's I mean, the guy, I don't know the guy, I'm not trying to be mean. He's horrible. He's one of the worst talent evaluators. Literally just go look at consensus big board and pick the highest guy and you would kick his ass in a draft contest. He's terrible, 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 terrible.
Okay. Well, tell us how you really feel, Brad. So
Yeah.
yeah, and then the offensive line is, of course, continued to have issues, as you mentioned, directly related to the player that they drafted in 2022 in Ed Ingram. And so, okay, yeah, right. The draft picks and Jordan Addison is a big part of this, but the draft picks so far have not been contributing. But I think where maybe it's as concerning as anything is I look around the league at teams that are pretty nasty to play against. And you see San Francisco, Philadelphia, even the Pittsburgh Steelers, and I look at how loaded up they are in the defensive line. And the only answer that the Vikings have to having no one who can get after the passer not named Daniil Hunter, who might not be here in a year, very possible he's not here, is to just blitz all the time because they can't create pressure anywhere else. And there's also nobody else coming. It's very clear that Patrick Jones and DJ Wanham are not going to be starters for the future. They drafted Asazia Tomowo in the 5th round. He's already off the team. I mean, Jaquelin Roy got in the game. Andre Carter got in the game yesterday, but these are late round picks who, if they're contributors at all at any point, that would be an outlier. So I think that on the defensive side, when you talk about that drafting, and they spent the first couple of draft picks on the defensive side trying to rebuild the secondary, I understood that part of it to try to draft Lewis Cine, draft Andrew Booth Jr., and fill up the secondary. But at the same time, like they have so far to go. I mean, Justin Herbert looked like he was on a beach. He just was having no problems at all sitting back there and demolishing the Vikings defense. And then the week before, you're coming off giving up 260 yards on the ground to the Philadelphia Eagles. The only thing I would come back to is that when you're talking about rebuilding parts, I mean, it's hard to expect that the parts would be built now when you're having to rebuild them, right? Like when you lose Darius Smith, when you lose Dalvin Tomlinson, like that's kind of the point. But I think the defensive line is a focus for me because those aren't young players like Dean Lowry, Harrison Phillips. These are not young players. These are experienced players who are getting pushed around or not being able to get to the quarterback. And what is the answer in the future? If you're spending your top first round draft pick on a quarterback next year, which makes sense, there's still so much to take care of on the defensive side. And I think it's become clear it's not just a meh defense, it's a defense that each week could give up history to the other team.
Oh no, it's comfortably a bottom five defense in the NFL, and Flores has no choice but to blitz. At the league high rate, him and Wink Martindale are probably going to go back and forth for the crown in that category all season long. It's the only choice he has. But then you leave corners on an island. I mean, I made fun of Caleb Evans for the tip to Josh Palmer. That might have been one of his better reps of the game, frankly, because he almost made a play. And then to the offense. I think we probably saw Ed Ingram's last start at right guard. So, I mean, you signed Dalton Risner for a reason. I know he's historically been a left guard. I think Ezra Cleveland, I think, is actually a solid player. I know it's not this front office, but I think he's fine. He's not a great pass blocker, but I think he's good enough. He's serviceable. So I would assume the plan is to just slot Risner in at right guard for Ingram, who had a sub 50 pass block grade for I don't know the 10th week in a row. So it's just tough. And the last piece we didn't mention, and I can't speak negatively on this because I touted the signing, I touted the player, but it stinks. Is Marcus Davenport is super talented, but this is kind of his issue, right? Is he just can't get on the field, and it's really glaring right now. I mean, if he was out there, I do think it's okay. Well, they have another piece opposite of Daniil. They can run some stuff and find way, especially if they blitz. I think he'd have some production. So again, I can't speak negatively on it. I love the signing. I love the player, but he plays 450 snaps a season, for a reason.
Folks, want to remind you to make Little Caesars the official pizza sponsor of the NFL part of your game day. Order online during their Pizza pregame 1 hour before NFL games and get ready for some football and fun. Choose your favorite Little Caesars pizza or pick the toppings you crave. Either way, you win. And speaking of winning, everyone scores with convenient delivery or their in-store pizza portal pickup. So grab some friends and enjoy a few slices during the tastiest hour before kickoff. Well, and that's part of it is, when you go back and kind of look at, all right, how are you spending the money that you have and how did you manage the entire offseason to get to this point? And I do think it's fair to say when the idea is to make the playoffs that starting out 0-3 is unacceptable, even if there is the part of us that goes, boy, Drake May threw a left-handed pass the other day and that looked pretty good. I'm not sure you're going to be quite far enough down to get Drake May, but I do think that we can start to look now at what all of the offseason moves meant to how this team looks. And with Marcus Davenport, I went on the day that they signed him and I said, I think this is a good type of play for a guy that's not that much money, who has, kind of a down year, but lots of pressures and maybe he's upswings. But at the same time, he never plays 600 snaps in a season. I mean, Everson Griffin at his best is playing 900 snaps, and this guy has never played 600. So there's going to be issues along the way. The day before the season, he hurts his ankle. It hasn't been able to get better. And each week they go into it and go, I don't know what's going on with Marcus Davenport. But that's another part is that, Kwesi Adofo-Mensah has made a lot of bets on players. Hey, let's make a bet on Jalen Reagor. Let's make a bet on Marcus Davenport that just have not played out. And we'll see what happens with another bet that they're taking on Cam Akers, sort of just taking swings at players who other teams don't want. And I don't know, maybe that's the best you can do when you're lacking in the cap space and they're trying to get that right for the future. So what I'm trying to keep in mind is also what they inherited, what they were asked to do right from the start, which was to try to win, which meant void years for players. It meant signing Zadarius Smith. It meant, keeping certain guys, bringing back Patrick Peterson last year. So some of these things put them in this position where they couldn't just go out and get better players. Davenport was kind of the best they could do. But if you're asking for a patchwork defense, it's not a very good looking patchwork defense so far.
That's the issue with Davenport. In this context, is he's kind of a luxury, right? Like you look at like the Eagles bringing in Hassan Reddick, for example. It's like okay, like if he's bad because the sample size is small and they're like if he's bad, okay, they still probably have a top 5 defensive line in the NFL. And if he's good, they have 70 sacks and break records last year, right? Like you're bringing a guy who realistically needs to be your number 2 edge and played 900 snaps, like you said, and he's never played, he's never played 500. Forget 600. He's never played 500 snaps in a season. So Yeah, I mean that's part of it too. Is the context of like the investment in a vacuum, I think is fine, but what you're actually needing that player to be is probably more than you realistically should expect from that contributor just based on historical production. Yeah, it's tough. And then I will say, look, I know Adam Thielen had a big stat line last night, but do not be sad he got let go. The guy cannot separate at all. It says more about the defense they play last night than him. He's been terrible through the first 2 weeks. Um, Zadarius has been good, but he was not playing in Minnesota on the contract he was on. That's why he went to Cleveland, got a raise, and got the third year of the deal chopped off. So don't get confused by that. Like decisions, Eric Kendricks did not play this week, has been pretty bad so far. Like all those decisions have been the correct decisions. I think, to a degree. It's just it's tough that it's all kind of snowballing in a negative direction right out of the gate.
Right. And so I think about like we need to separate into categories what made sense at the time, what didn't make sense, and how it's all played out so far. And I wonder, I got a question about this the other day, and I didn't really know how to answer it. When someone asked about the way they handled Kirk Cousins' contract. So they needed to get cap compliant. They restructured his deal. It looked like there was a chance that they were restructuring to kind of push down the road to give them more time to potentially work out an extension, but then they did not work out an extension. And it's at least very clear at this moment that's not happening anytime soon. And if they miss the playoffs, then I think it's all over. It's a Derek Carr Raiders type of situation where he just, ends up hitting free agency. Should they regret that though? I mean, because they kind of waited to try to trade people. And then the other one I'm interested in whether they should regret it is the way they handled Daniil Hunter. Because Daniil Hunter, I believe at this moment leads the league in sacks, and it's made basically no difference at all. And just like last year. I mean, he was great last year, but it's just a defense is a complete thing. And they gave him a good amount of money and they didn't trade him for something which presumably there would have been draft capital on the table, and they're one of the worst defenses in the NFL. I mean, yet that's complete hindsight, but at the same time, if you were asking Daniil Hunter to be your whole defense, I think we've already seen that movie before. So those two decisions, how should they feel about them now?
I think Kirk, realistically, you still just thought, hey, we're not going to get the value that we're looking for. Because that's the thing is, we talk all the time about his inability to be franchise tagged, yada yada. That plays into every single calculation possible. Like a team's not going to trade a whole lot for him either, entering a contract year, because they would have to either extend him the moment he arrives in the building, or no, they're trading for a quarterback who's 35 years old, who they can't franchise tag, who if he does play well can bend them over a barrel, and if he doesn't play well, you kind of just wasted the draft pick and a bunch of cash. So I'm okay with how they handled that one. I actually think they probably arguably handled it correctly. I get you could have shopped him and tried to start over, but at least the offense is like a competent offense. Hunter, I think he is a guy at the trade deadline that you should be shopping, not taking calls on. You should be making the phone calls and saying, "Hey, this guy has like most sacks in the NFL. Sure, a lot of them are cleanup pressures and sacks so far, but still, he's a great player. Yeah, you should be calling other teams and saying he's a heck of a guy. He's a we love him, but you should take him in and give us a third, second round pick for him. I think you have to do that.
Yeah, I guess I was thinking with Kirk about the dead cap for next year that it's going to be 28 million if he leaves, and the way they restructure that, you were still going to pay dead cap over the future years, but it was going to be less and more spread out over a couple of years. So, I mean, I understand some of the logic to that point, but it just seemed that they were doing that to buy them time to see if they could trade Zadarius and Dalvin Cook, and what they got was like a swap of picks in total for that, right? So I wondered about like sort of staying to their price. And this is another thing about the front office that I wonder about is they've done this a lot. So like with Dalton Reisner, they stayed to their price and they waited until Reisner was just going to take pretty much anything to have a job and remain in the NFL, when they could have raised their price a little bit and they could have just, had Dalton Reisner playing right guard and not the worst right guard in football instead. Right. And the same thing sort of goes for Justin Jefferson, which I think is the next part of our conversation here. It seems that they stuck to their price and Jefferson wouldn't come to where they wanted to meet, and we don't have a deal done. And now the team is 0-3. And now you're talking about if this season goes completely sideways, asking Justin Jefferson, hey, I know we just won 4 games, or I know we just won 6 games, but could you please just sign what we want you to sign, just right here? I mean, I think that it complicates some things, and I wonder about the if you're not going to be a little bit flexible and come over to the player's side, or if you're going to try to hold steady on what you want to trade Delvin Cook for all the way to the end and then miss your window to do it. Like, is that going to be a good approach long term for the front office?
I do think it is in some ways good to set those precedents. I know it's easy to point to some examples of it not working out. I mean, first, I would say I don't think there were any actual offers for Dalvin Cook. And again, I talked about Thielen, and he looks terrible. I mean, he looks like he played Ezekiel Elliott this week, and Ezekiel Elliott looked infinitely less washed than Dalvin Cook did in that game. So no one was taking on what $10.5 million or whatever. I'm shocked he even got 7, and the Jets might be shopping him because he has a bunch of per game roster bonuses associated with his deal. They're probably begging someone to take him off their hands already. So, and then as for the other stuff, like look, Jefferson, I think we agree there. You just get it done. Like you just beat CD Lamb, beat Jamar Chase. Not that those guys are going to make more or they're going to materially impact Jefferson's money, but should have gotten it done. But at the same time, I think those precedental type moves do, and down the road they come back into play. Drawing a hard line and being a stickler on price and on value, you know, I know you could also say, well, they gave TJ Hawkinson like big money, et cetera, et cetera. Didn't have the greatest game this past week, himself. But I don't know. Anyway, not a great answer, a bit rambling, but I do think there is value in that. I have a lot of conversations about that where they can point to those precedents and kind of lean on that with other negotiations and other conversations. And you do say, oh, that makes sense. Like it probably did help them here. It just right now, a lot of it is kind of skewing in the other direction.
And when I say I'm wondering about it, I really am. Like I mean, I think that there is a good reason to pinch pennies for the future and not overspend on a Dalton Reisner so you could carry over cap space, and whatever cap space you can create for next year helps you pay Jefferson what you need to pay him and helps you rebuild some parts of the roster through free agency, because it's clear that on the defensive side that's going to have to be the way you do it. You're not just going to draft a Nick Bosa top 5 next year if you're having to draft a quarterback. So that means that you're having to go out into free agency to try to fill up a defensive line and so forth. And that's where, well, the Jefferson thing though, uh, is do you think there's anything to that part about the unhappiness factor? Because I feel like with Jefferson, normally what I would say is, come on, $100 million in your pocket, you're fine, have a great day. But Jefferson's a different kind of dude. I mean, I really think that he is so winning obsessed. I think that last year he had a lot of fun, and this year he's not, regardless of his numbers, that he's frustrated as heck with this team. And I mean, I think if the guy's looking around going, do you guys have a plan? Do you guys have answers? That he is going to treat it differently than he would, even though it is way advantageous for him to sign. But I think he might treat it differently than he would if they had won 13 games again.
Yeah, I'm sure he will. And maybe he'll just want more guarantees or more overall money or only take a 3-year extension, which I'm guessing was the goal this past offseason as well. And I'm guessing Minnesota hated that idea. So yeah, maybe. But I think regardless, he's asking for league changing money. I mean, I loved his answer, one of the coolest answers ever, and it's true where he got asked, I don't know who, you probably know who it was, have you talked to other players, in similar situations about, and he was like, with all due respect, like, no, because no one's gone through what I'm going through because I'm so much different. It was the coolest answer of all time. So, like, I think I get the winning, and you can tell. I mean, he looks depressed. He looks like, the Stephon Diggs meme. I don't know who's a bill for that meme, but like, that's Jefferson every week, it looks like, on the sideline when they're losing games. So, I know it's eating at him. I know he doesn't just care about money. I think though I would imagine this organization has convinced him they care about him. They're going to find a way to get a quarterback and figure things out. Yada yada yada. But yeah, maybe it doesn't help.
Oh, you're certainly right. I also try not to, when it's football, and this is almost impossible, but just like live in the moment too much and be like, oh, Justin Jefferson's going to be, whatever. But at the end of the day, there's 2 franchise tags, and it still makes so much more sense. It could get a little bit ugly, but even when it got ugly with Bosa, at the end of the day, he signs and they're good to go. And it's just so set up to their for that to be better. But I think what you worry about when you're in Minnesota, because you've seen things like this happen so many times, is the guy gets so frustrated that then he's going in public talking about wanting to be traded, and then it starts to get pretty ugly. But we are a long way away from that conversation. In the big picture, in the timeline picture, I think it's ironic that going 0-3 doesn't hurt. In fact, probably helps, because if they were 3-0, and like they're not that far away from being 3-0, that's the odd part as well. But if they're 3-0, then we're wondering, wait, are they gonna, like, bring back Kirk because he's playing pretty well? And, like, are they gonna get to March and the Wilfs are gonna say, "You know what? Actually extend Kirk because look how good this offense is," or something. But if you end up going 6-11 on the season, there's really gonna be no argument for that, and they could just draft a quarterback. They can have the potential to trade up for one, and I think despite some miscues along the way, and despite like looking, pretty rough this year at times, and wasting a year of everybody's life on offense, all these great players, you're still looking at a great quarterback draft class. And it's like if you pull away from the individual, should they have done this at this time or that at that time? The big picture is you have opportunities with lots of potential quarterbacks to draft in the first round and then make something of this. And the worse you are, the better chances you get your guy. And I just can't pull away from thinking when you go 0-3 that there has to be a part of the general manager who goes, well, that's too bad. Yeah, right. Like watching football on Saturdays, I'm seeing a lot to work with, Brad.
Yeah, for sure. And the thing too is, I think if you look ahead and you were honest with yourself, you probably say, "I hope we start 2-1. We're probably going to start 1-2." You assume you beat Tampa Bay, and then you say, "Okay, Chargers and Eagles, two very good football teams. Those are going to be tough games." And like you said, they could have won both of those games. I mean, the fumble thing is bananas. Like it's truly out of this world. They have, I mean, Vaseline on their hands or something. It's nuts how they cannot hold on to the football. But yeah, so that's the thing too, is like it's probably one game worse than what their record, again, if you predicted before the season, I probably would have said, yeah, they win week 1, they lose the next 2 weeks, and then we go from there. The quarterback class is awesome. I mean, every Saturday you watch, and it's relevant to me as well, of course. And there are like 7, 8 kids that are really, really special. I mean, I also the edge rusher class is not there's a lot of good football players. I don't think there's any great ones, any Nick Bosa type guys, but I think if you have to go that route, you probably get a good football player. The tackle class, I guess the Vikings don't need tackles. But anyway, like it's a good class. The receivers are dope. You don't really need to go that direction either. And that maybe pushes defensive players down to you, maybe pushes quarterbacks down to you. And the last thing I'll say too is, I mean, Minnesota is better than these teams, but Tampa Bay, not awful. The Rams, not awful like we thought. The Cardinals, they're a plucky, fun team. The Texans, honestly, man, CJ Stroud without an offensive line has been awesome. So when he does get, two of the highest paid tackles in the NFL, back playing for him, they probably don't give the Cardinals like there is a path to where Minnesota has the top 10. I'm not going to say top 5, but has a top 10 pick like you're saying. Let's say they're sitting at 8 and they have to go to 4 to get a quarterback. Like I think it's very possible you pull that off.
And I think that when we talk about just the plan from the start, I think this was it. I mean, I think that they were figuring on either the first year they try to win and they don't, and then they trade up for one of these quarterbacks, whether it was, Young, Stroud, or Richardson, or they are good. And then it's still the next year. They knew at some point that all those key players were going to have to go, and that trying to replace everybody on defense, there was something that PFF did. And I forget which one of your great data scientists did it, but about turnover. And when you have a lot of churn on the roster and turnover from year to year, consistently it's worse. The team performs worse when there's a lot of people who change. And we saw this from the Vikings from like 2015 to 2017. They had mostly all the same players on defense. And lo and behold, they get to be the number one defense eventually. And I mean, there's a huge part of that. They've had churn at defensive coordinator. They've had, over the years on the offensive coordinator side and play caller side. I mean, this is very tough to overcome to expect you to be a legitimate Super Bowl contender. So it's like I think that when Kwesi Adofo-Mensah got here, the 2024 draft was the one they were probably looking at to pick a quarterback, which means that you're on track, but there's a lot of stuff that's sort of gone like how confident should we be in just the decision making in general? But if you pick the right quarterback, and by the way, hey, CJ Stroud, is it too soon to make the S2 cognition jokes? Because his cognition looks pretty darn good to me every time I see him play. So maybe we should just not worry too much about that. But speaking of cognition, the Bears. Wow. Wow, the Bears in front of Taylor Swift of all people. I mean, so what the Vikings have right now is three close losses where a lot of players have played really well and then a lot of things have gone wrong. What the Bears have is a total rocket ship runs into the sun and explodes into a gazillion pieces. The franchise is burning to the ground. Probably the Denver Broncos are the only team that's in a worse position and situation in the entire league. And yes, I know Caleb Williams is waiting, but my gosh, everything else is wrong as well. They've got to fire a coach, they've got to fire an offensive coordinator. Justin Fields looked competitive last year, now looks like the saddest person on earth. And by the way, when he clearly gets concussed, they put him back in the game. Could you make anything worse? And oh, the defensive coordinator just leaves. I mean, what in the world is going on with the Chicago Bears?
May have put two concussed players back in the game. I'm not sure why cornerback Tyreek Stevenson played yesterday after that early hit either. And they're so injured in the secondary, and they also just have zero talent. I mean, look, we had this conversation about hiring a defensive coach. I'll be honest, like I think Flus, like there were some signs you saw last year. They obviously have zero talent and still have close to zero talent, but you can't really say that. I mean, you use a bunch of day two picks on corners. You use a bunch of day two picks this year on interior defensive linemen. You sign two linebackers to, I mean, one to a massive contract, one to a solid contract for TJ Edwards. You sign Yannick Ngakoue, etc. They are 32nd in every single defensive metric you could possibly find. You could make up a new one at home, and they'd be 32nd in that as well. I mean, they are laugh out loud bad on both sides of the ball, but in particular, when you hire a 50-plus-year-old defensive coach to, of course, come in and inherit a quarterback. And shocker, it's not working. Yeah, Luke Getsy is, outside of Matt Canada, probably the worst offensive coordinator in the NFL. I mean, you're starting to see quit now, which I don't blame the players for, but the body language is as bad as it gets. This is the worst team in the NFL. By a wide margin, the worst team in the NFL. The saving grace is Carolina's pretty bad too. I love Bryce Young, but he's going to struggle as a rookie when they have no one that can separate, and the offensive line is a bunch of injuries now too. But yeah, it is worse than the Trestman era. Like this is, you always say it, like I don't know where rock bottom is. I'm saying as a guy who watched them pick number one overall last year, or earn that draft pick at least. This is way, way, way worse. And here I'll say this: the last piece to put it, because you mentioned Denver. Denver lost 70-20 yesterday. Denver gave up the most points, arguably ever, because 1950s football. Who cares? It had the worst defensive performance in the history of time. Second most yards ever, 726 yards, which I doubt the Bears even have on the season so far. And the Denver Broncos are favored in Chicago next week, and they should be. They should be.
In Chicago. I saw that tickets are going for $2.11, which
Good.
is far too much. Yeah, would not pay.
Yeah. No.
Would not pay. Really looking forward to that trip though. When we go to Chicago, and it could be 1-4 versus 0-5, but Chicago food will hold me over for at least that game. Uh, are the Chicago Bears in the worst position in the NFL, or is that not quite the case because they could draft number one? Because I feel like number one, if you get Caleb Williams, it does cure all ills, as we saw with like Joe Burrow, where, I mean, was there a worse franchise than Cincinnati when they drafted Joe Burrow? Uh, but there is a part of me that says, I've always kind of shrugged off the idea that a quarterback could say, "Oh, I'm not playing for that team" or whatever. But man, he could stay for one more year and make whatever $10 million playing at USC just to see if there's a better franchise. I mean, I don't know. There are very few teams that I would ever even think to talk about this. I mean, Trevor Lawrence went to the Jaguars. What a horror show they were at the time. But this is as low as I can. I mean, this is like early 2000s Cincinnati Bengals type of low. This is total, complete dysfunction from a franchise.
You did touch on it though. So the 2 points for me are, I would argue like I'd rather be Chicago than Denver because at least I don't have an expensive roster. I have the cheapest roster in the league, or maybe second cheapest behind New England, whatever. You have, like I said, 2 draft picks that very well could be top 5, probably at this point borderline guaranteed to have 2 top 10 draft picks. And that is the last piece. Whether Williams or Drake May, if they somehow, pull a Texans and get the second spot, I think those guys there are 2 talented, like, again, not generational, yada yada, but like very, very talented prospects. Here's the thing though about Caleb Williams, which I find fascinating. Forget the whole conversation of can he just not go, which is very possible. I would hope that a major city and a cool city is a help. I think Caleb Williams has the right to legitimately say, I want significant say in who the head coach is. I think we might see a college kid before he goes to the team dictate the head coach hire, and I have no problem with it. I have like you hire Bill Polian, who's I don't know 85 years old, to run a search that leads to a final 3 of Dan Quinn, Matt Eberflus, and Jim Caldwell. You paid money to a guy to give you that final 3 and force your young GM, who I think is now getting railroaded. Has he been great? No. I think there's been a lot of good there. And I think if they do fire, everyone, they're probably gonna fire him too, which I kind of think sucks. But anyway, like I'd rather Caleb Williams hire the head coach than George McCaskey. I mean, he's got to be the worst owner or up there in the. I mean, he is beyond incompetent. Has no idea what he's doing in any way, shape, or form on the football side. Last piece, our guy Kevin Warren. I also kind of hope that he can at least like he knows how to lead and how to do some things. Obviously, did a lot of good things in Minnesota. That's kind of a saving grace for me to a degree as well. But yeah, if they get the next quarterback pick wrong, it's just like it's tough, man. It's tough being a Bears fan. They are as bad as it gets.
Okay, final thing. Uh, who do you think's the best team in football? Oh, you're taking a drink. Okay. Then now, who's the best team in football?
Sorry, I had to prepare myself. You know, it's crazy because I don't like Brock Purdy, but the Niners are just ridiculous. And I'm a trenches guy, and they are the best team on the defensive line. Their offensive line is not good enough, but the weapons are crazy. No Brandon Ayuk didn't matter for them either. I'll go there. I'll do it. I mean, the offensive line's got to get better, but they are just fast, physical, and if they can stay healthy, I think they're as good as anyone.
I will not have a hot take here and say Miami. I mean, you put up
Yeah.
70. I'm impressed. I'm impressed. I've always thought that blowouts matter. Like how many times you just truck the other team says a lot about your team's strength. That if you don't have to beat bad teams close, you just run away from them. And plus, they have the most creative offense. And if Tua stays healthy, he is looking like a top-notch quarterback. So they've got everything. Their defense isn't a joke either. I mean, I think they have a very, very strong argument right now. And Dallas would have been until what? So yeah, classic McCarthy era type of team where you beat, some good teams or you blow out some bad teams and then you play another one and just what? So I don't know. What a crazy, crazy beginning to our lives covering the 2023 NFL season. This is why we do it. Follow Brad at pff.com and on Twitter. A great follow and one of the best, if no, I think the best front office analyst in the world. So, Brad, thanks so much for your time as always. And we will talk again very soon, sir.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Sorry for the rants, everyone, but thanks for having me.
What would this show be without rants? Are you
Fair,
serious?
fair.
This is what it's all about. Thanks, Brad.